Welcome to the Jobs and Work podcast. If you're like most Americans, you spend a significant amount of your time working. In fact, we spend more time at our jobs than anywhere else. But how often do we really talk about work in America? On this podcast, the Work for Change team will. Work for Change, LLC is a team of social scientists, thought leaders, and digital storytellers who dig into the critical issues affecting American workers and workplaces today. Our podcast is co-hosted by Dr. Kendra Jason and myself, Dr. Kris Maycumber. We'll also bring guests onto the show who reflect the diversity of the American workforce. We are so excited for you to join us as we lead the efforts to humanize the workplace by building dignity and equity into jobs, work, and organizations. Please subscribe to the podcast and share us with your friends and family. You can learn more about Work for Change at workforchangellc.com. Happy Friday, everybody. Welcome back to the Jobs and Work podcast. This is our 10th episode, so we're really excited about talking to y'all today. I am your co-host, Kris Maycumber.
And I am co-host Kendra Jason.
The third Friday of every month, we have a series called In the News, which is where we pick something that's going on in our society that's being talked about in the news. And today, what we're going to be talking about is why a lot of diversity efforts fail. So you've probably been hearing a lot about diversity trainings and workplaces responding to a variety of issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. What we're learning is that a lot of these programs fail and they're not living up to the expectations. So Kendra and I are going to jump into this conversation with spotlighting why diversity efforts fail.
Yeah, and I want to prepare our audience because, Kris and I are not going to be superficial in this conversation and just skirt around the issues that are often how they're discussed in the news. We're going to talk about our own personal experiences as consultants, working with organizations, what we know from our years of research in this area of work and organizations, and especially racial inequality. When we're talking about diversity efforts now, we're really talking about racial diversity efforts. It's inclusive of a conversation about gender and about sexuality and ableism and things of that nature. But specifically, right now, when we're talking about diversity issues in the news, it really is about racial interactions, racial justice, and interactions and communications between different workers. So I'm going to jump right into it and say, from my experience, one of the main problems why these efforts don't get absorbed into the organization is because the efforts are very white-centric. And what that means is that your organizational leaders and your staff or employees, mostly the organizational leaders, because they're the ones who set up the training programs and they bring in the consultants or they try to form working groups or task forces and tackle it on their own, is that they frame it in a way that is easily digestible for their white employees because they don't want to disrupt comfort, right? They don't want their white employees to feel uncomfortable. They may feel, well, there's already some hesitancy towards doing this, or, we don't want people to feel uncomfortable and we don't want tension in our workplace because there's already so much going on and we don't want to really, scratch below the surface and uncover some things that are really braiding into the fabric of your organization that's having some real psychological, mental, and physical effects on your racial minority workers. And so when I say it's centered around whiteness, I'll just give you an example. So one of the things that I'm noticing is that a lot of leadership starts these conversations and they say, we have to have this difficult conversation, or they always frame it in, we're having these difficult conversations. And I just want to help you acknowledge that even framing the conversation as difficult is white-centric. You may ask, how is that? It's white-centric because who is it difficult for? It's difficult for the white people in the room, right? It's actually not difficult for your Black, Hispanic, Asian, other people that are in the room. It's long overdue, right? And so actually a lot of your racial minority employees are eager and anxious, not saying they're necessarily looking forward to the dynamics of the conversation, but the fact that you frame it as difficult taps into the white psyche of it's difficult for us. But if the target and the solutions are supposed to be about making the workplace better and more comfortable for your more marginalized employees, which are your Black and brown employees, if they're not feeling discomfort, then you're not speaking to them. Who you're speaking to is the white people in the room. And thus, in framing it as a difficult conversation, you are actually maybe further alienating and disconnecting from your Black and brown employees who don't frame it or sense it or internalize the conversations as difficult. And so what would be a good strategy for you to do or to figure out through your reading, through your research, is how do you frame the conversation? Maybe just remove the word difficult altogether. It's time to have this conversation. We're entering a conversation. But once you put that adjective that connects to your emotions, which is often centered in whiteness, that's where that white centrality emerges at the very top of the conversation.
Kendra, and I also think too, I mean, that you just laid out a fantastic, and I think what you laid out is something that most people, most employers and managers aren't thinking about, which is the sort of inception of this work, which is why process is so important. I think where they go wrong, why these programs and trainings fail, and oftentimes what research is now showing is not only fail, but are counterproductive or actually causing harm within the organization. So then the organization ends up like kind of eating itself, or it implodes. They lose workers, people leave, they flee, right? Because things get kind of toxic. And I think what this speaks to is there's like two, I think, really fundamental pieces to doing this work well. And one is like content, and the other is process. And I think white people in white culture are really quick to say, look, we have some content. Let's do something. Let's jump into action mode. Look, we have this sort of checklist. And what I've seen from being in, a variety of different organizational contexts is this impetus to cross it off the list. Like, look, we addressed racial equity in May. Like, let's do that. Let's cross that off of our list of things that we got done this quarter or this month or this spring. And it's like, this work is not a line item. It didn't have we didn't come to racial inequality overnight. It's built into the structure of our organizations. It's built into how power gets distributed and how it flows within organizations. So it is not going to be addressed. You can't address it as an appendage to the existing work. It has to be a part and parcel of the way the organization functions. And that's where the process comes in. So content, you can look online and get content about like how to address diversity. There's a bunch of resources. There's a wealth of information. The content is the easy part. The process, I think, is where people go wrong. Like you said, even framing it as a difficult conversation, that's a part of how that process unfolds. Already you've got people rolling their eyes, sitting back going, difficult for who? Or maybe how you frame things is a part of that process. And I think this speaks to the lack of diversity in the people in charge. Who's sitting in the room making the decisions about how racial equity work is going to be addressed? And what it does is, if you don't have a diverse group of people and you don't have people of color in that conversation shaping the process, it's tone deaf. It ends up being, like you said, white centric. So what they do is they hire a person of color to come in to do this work, and it's setting them up for failure because you've already created this environment where you're not making you're not having these really thoughtful conversations. And then you're saying, look, we're going to bring in so-and-so to help us find our way out, when really the groundwork has not been laid.
Yeah, let me talk a little bit more about unpacking that process and where organizations go wrong by making it white centric. So another thing that happens is that the resources that are often being used are written by white people about white experiences. Of course, the main example right now is Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, which many white people have looked to as sort of like the holy grail of how to understand this process. And there's nothing wrong, of course, with getting more information about white fragility and race relations. But if you get it from a white source, right, and then you use that white source as the mainframe and the context for how you think about and distribute this information, the messaging that you send is that white people only listen to other white people, right? There have been scholars of color, researchers of color, consultants of color who have been doing this work since the beginning of time, right? I mean, for a very, very long time, contemporary and historical. Yeah. And if your main go-to is a white researcher or a white book or a white consulting agency, right? Then the message that you're sending is that, hey, we as white people will only accept this information if it's easily digestible for us. And that's another thing about Robin DiAngelo's book, the feedback that I've heard, like, white people like it because, it's really easily digestible. It's really comfortable. We need to be comfortable in order to absorb this information. Yeah. Again, that comfortability of using white resources and only framing it in a way that white people can only listen to white people in order to move forward, again, pushes your people of color, your Black and brown employees to the margins once again, because your Black and brown employees aren't really reading White Fragility, right? They're reading and doing other type of work. Kris, do you want to say something before I move on to my second point?
No, I was hanging on my seat here waiting for you. That was, I was commenting on how it's true. Like that has become such a dominant frame and it's kind of problematic. So.
Yep. And then the second part related to white fragility. And again, the reason why process is so important and self-reflection and knowledge building and working on your such a huge part of the process in the beginning, but throughout, is because white fragility is what prevents these diversity initiatives from sticking, right? And so one example, white women crying. We get it all the time. At the very beginning, consultation, we're in there, we're talking to a group, and within 5 to 10, 15 minutes, we have a white woman crying, emotional about, some type of concern. She doesn't want to be misunderstood. She's been doing the work, but she's still doing it wrong. This work makes her very uncomfortable, right? And so if you really think about the white fragility, which is basically the white discomfort when you're talking about racial injustice, I'm not saying that those white women, in this case of the example that I'm giving, are not experiencing those emotions. But when you really think about white privilege, white fragility, a part of the psychology and the psychosis that is inspiring that emotion is that they are reminding the room that they are the actual victims. And the focus needs to be turned around back on them, because this conversation about Black and brown people, this conversation about racial injustice does not include or center their emotions and their positionality, which is really the discomfort, right? And so when you're starting a meeting or you're having these conversations and you have one or more women, white women especially, this is a pattern, you can look in the literature, I'm not picking on white women, you can look in the literature, and they break out in tears, they shift the room. They, and this is an effort that disrupts the process, because I promise you, and again, this is historically noted in the literature, when white women cry, everybody in the room responds. because we have been trained as a society to make white women comfortable. That's where the damsel in distress,
Yep.
little saying comes from. The damsel is not a Hispanic woman. The damsel in distress is literally a white woman. That's the imagery that comes along. So along with the white fragility that white women express, white men express white fragility in a totally different way. They express white fragility through aggression, right? It's really inspired by fear and insecurity, but it is expressed by aggression. And the way this aggression comes out can be anything small from being physically, through physical body language that says, I'm closed off, I'm not interested, I don't agree with this, to literally storming out of the room. Right. And so I really want you to think about, as a white person, right? As a white person doing this work, being in these conversations for years, how often do you see Black women cry in a meeting about racial injustice or where they're feeling uncomfortable? How often do you see Black men under this topic storm out of a room or raise a fit? I'm not saying it doesn't happen, right? But it's really interesting that the target of improvement of raising the comfort is again on Black and brown people. And we should be centering their experience, their emotions, their interactions as a part of this process, understanding their experiences, emotions, interactions as a part of the process. But because we lack self-reflection, then we center ourselves, or basically white people in this sense, when we're talking about diversity efforts, they center themselves, they become emotional, and they cry and they storm out the room. And this is just happens over and over again. So once that presence is set, right? Once you have those first few meetings, you have people crying and storming out the room or being contentious, how do you think that sets up the rest of the learning series? How do you think that sets up the next meeting, right? So,
yeah, I've been, in a lot of rooms with white people doing different diversity and racial equity work, whether it's like in a white caucus, right, a white space, white only space, or multiracial space. And yeah, the white tears are, and what it also does too is, like you already said, it then makes it about them. It makes it about, and what I've seen and is that a lot of white people want a standing ovation for doing the work. And when they don't get it, specifically from Black and brown coworkers, like from Black and brown peers, or, whoever they're doing this work with. And if they don't feel like their Black and brown coworkers are receptive and are applauditory and are like, honoring them for doing racial justice work, they get very defensive. It's very much like, I'm doing this work and it's, this is hard for me to do and I'm being vulnerable. And if that's not seen as, if I'm not getting sort of accolades and rewarded by my Black and brown coworkers or peers, then like there's an expectation. And I think a lot of this, you talked about the psychology, like as social scientists, we focus on these broader patterns, but there's a social psychological component to this where people's investments in their identities as good people gets in the way of them doing like really more sort of radical, meaning just getting at the root of problems, because they're like, no, I'm a liberal white person. I'm a good white person. I, donate to the Black Lives Matter movement. I've gone to Black Lives Matter protests. I'm a good person. Right. So sometimes our investments in our identities as good people gets in the way of acknowledging how we might be reinforcing problematic ideas, behaviors, actions, etc.
And what I'll say to that, thank you so much, Kris, for bringing this up, because I can tell you, I'm a Black person. I live in a Black body. I work in a professional setting. I work with white people and going to school with white people all my life, right? And especially now, what I think is really interesting, for lack of a better word, and also a part of the process, is that, white people often come to me and say, and I'm exaggerating. Hey, see me? I'm doing the work. Did you see what I did? I'm reading the book. Da 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 da. Right. And I'm like, okay, that's great. Right. And so the reason why I bring that up, and it's sort of in a comical sense, is because, I'll say this message. If any white people are watching this podcast, the 20 of you who watch our podcast, thank you very much. That your Black coworkers see the work that you're doing. They see if and when you speak up in meetings. They see the public work that you're doing. We see it, right? We don't necessarily need you coming to us basically saying, did you see what I did?
Yeah.
You may not be doing it for appraisal, but just the fact that you're doing it for acknowledgement is a part of this whole process of centering whiteness and centering yourself as well. What's more important to Black people, Black and brown people who are facing racial injustice at work, is what we don't see. How are you advocating for your Black and brown employees in closed room meetings? How are you writing policy? How are you organizing? How are you talking to us and about us in meetings and communication, right? How are you truly representing our experiences without translating it into something that's easily digestible for your white employees? I'll give you a quick example. I came across doing some diversity work a while ago, and in some of the feedback that the organization has sent me, they say, one of the issues are that our Black employees seem to be having problems with unfair treatment. Our Black employees seem to be having problems with unfair treatment, right? And that seems like a very innocent statement. But knowing the history of this organization, Black workers have filed grievances about the injustices that they perceive they were going through, right? They have formed formal complaints. They have expressed these things in committee meetings and work meetings. So to reinterpret that as Black employees seem like they are experiencing unfair practices versus saying Black employees have expressed that they perceive or feel that they were treated unfairly. There's a difference.
Yeah.
They seem like, or it has been documented that.
Yeah. That framing is huge, Kendra. The way it's framed is powerful. It's profound. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And this is a part of the problem of not being honest in your communication, of watering down and diluting the message or the issue to, again, make it comfortable and easily digestible for other white members of the organization. Because for the Black members who are reading these same memos and who are reading these same communications, they're saying, it just seems like that's happening, or have we expressed and made a formal complaint and tried to have formal conversations to improve these workplace conditions? But by you rephrasing it as this is something that seems to be happening, that totally disregards that experience and further, again, alienates and marginalizes your Black employees.
Yeah, and that sets a whole tone, right? That sets a climate has already been established, right? Mm-hmm. In terms of how the work is framed. Language is really powerful. And again, I think it comes back to who gets to make the decisions about how that language gets framed. And if you have a white only or predominantly, or even tokenism, if you've got one person of color put on the committee, right, that's not going to create any sort of widespread culture change. Mm-hmm. And that's what makes this organizational diversity efforts not successful, is it becomes a line item, it becomes an appendage, it becomes like an arm of the organization rather than the organization. It has to become a part of the process. One of the news stories that I had read about why the diversity efforts fail, I think it was in the Harvard Business review said also what's happening is that it's seen as like one of the skills that managers can improve upon. But what they're not doing is evaluating managers, like putting this as part of like a good manager, a core competency of a good manager is that they know how to assemble a diverse team. They know how to handle divergent viewpoints. They know how to empower marginalized workers, that isn't how they're evaluated. They have to go to diversity trainings, but they're not being evaluated. Their job success doesn't depend on how well they are at diversity work. It's still, which I think is a different approach. That's building it into the structure of the job of being a manager versus making them come to this separate space where they might have to attend a training. You know what I mean? It's like building it into the job structure, into the actual role of being a good manager. And I thought that was a really great insight into how it's got to be a part of how work is done in the organization, not just something that they sometimes do.
So Kris and I are organizational consultants across a broad range of topics. We really center equity, dignity, we say it all the time, having a humanistic approach, because honestly, because managers, leaders, just in general, diversity training or building diversity in your organization is not a part of management training. It's not a part of when you get your college degree. So you can read the literature on it, you can read news articles on it, but what it would really benefit you, we think, of course, is that you hire external consultants. And this is what Kris and I do so that we can coach you as organizational leaders and managers, and help train your staff and your self through learning series about how to do this work well, how to embed it in the process. And we're really honest. I mean, we meet you where you are. This conversation was really, really blunt and straightforward. But, we meet you where you are. We try to, help you progress in a way that you can make effective, long-lasting change. It's not a one-shot stop with us. We do we have engagement, and we have post-assessments, and then we build a plan for longevity. And so you can reach Kris and I at workforchange.llc.com. That's work, the number 4, changellc.com. You found us here on YouTube, but you can also like, subscribe, and share Work for Change on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So please like, subscribe, and share to all of those sources so that we can work to make the world of work better.